Welcome to the 7th lesson of our EDU Onyx series on learning Python. Today we will be covering reading and writing files within the Python programming language. Most programs you will write will need some way to store data that persists for more than a single session of the program. Variables can store data from user input, but as soon as we close our program, that data is essentially gone till the next run of the program session. Right now, all of the programs we have been writing either work with data that has been built into the program with variables that have been supplied values, or has been supplied by the user for a single program session. In order to store data that persists over multiple runs of a single program, you will need to learn how to read data from files and write data to files.
In order to start reading and writing files with Python, we will need to look at the basics of an advanced concept in programming, which we will study later in detail, known as object-oriented programming. Objects are simply abstract data structures that have both attributes and functions, which can perform actions involving the specific object we are working with. Objects themselves are simply instances of classes, which are predefined sets of instructions for the functions and attributes for a specific object. For example, you might think of a class as the blueprints for how to build a specific machine, and the object as the actual machine. The object performs the actions and has the attributes defined for its class. We will go into more specific detail concerning programming with objects later, but for right now, we only need to understand the basics of objects to write data to file. In the same way that you would define a variable, you can create an object by creating a name and assigning it data of whatever object type you wish it to be. You can create a file object by using the open function in Python, which will return a file object to whatever name you wish. This function will open a file and create a file object for you in Python to perform actions with. You will need to specify a file name as a string for the open function, and also you'll need to specify a mode. In this case, to start off, we will use the string w for the mode parameter to specify that we are going to write data to our file. Let's start off by creating a simple file object and writing some data to it. To start, we'll need a name similar to how we created variables early on in this course. The same rules apply for variable names as they do to creating objects. Next, let's assign this variable to the open function and pass it a file name as a parameter first. And in the next parameter, we'll add a comma to denote that we're heading to the next parameter for this function, and then we'll type the string w to specify that we want to create a file for writing. If the file that we're looking for doesn't already exist, when we specify the w string, Python will create the file. Next, let's create some basic text that we can write to this file, and so we can look at how objects work a little closer. Just create a simple string variable with some text in it. And then, from here, we can look at the basics of our file object. Our file object has several functions we can call from itself. First, we'll reference the file object, and then add a dot to let Python know we want to access a function of the file object. From there, we can use the write function, which will write whatever data we pass it to the file object. From here, we can type our string and now, when we run this program, our phrase string will be written to the file. But in order to finish up, when you open a file, you also must close it at the end. which is another method of the file object. All you need to do now is save and run this program, and it will create and write the string to your hard drive. While there won't be any direct output to the Python console to let you know that your file has written properly, you can navigate to your Python directory and locate the file that you have created and make sure the text you have written to file is in there. This is the same file that we've just created, but loaded up in a text editor so we can see the contents. Python has properly written the string we have passed it to our file object to file. There is a very similar process involved for reading data from file. Let's use the same file that we just wrote and read it back into Python and then print the text to make sure that we can use our file object. So first, let's create another file object with another open function statement. Let's use the same file name that we created before to make sure we load the right file. But this time, for the next parameter, let's specify an R, which lets Python know we want to read data from this file instead of write to it. Next, let's create our phrase string again, but this time, let's not pass it any data from Python, but rather, let's get some data from our file by using the read function that is part of our file object. Then, let's close our file object. And then print the data that is stored in the phrase string now. Then save and run the program to see the results. Python has loaded our data from file into our file object and then printed it through our phrase string. Now that we've looked at both reading and writing files, let's create a simple program that keeps a list of usernames from run session to run session. So first, we'll need a variable to hold the current username of this run session. We want to get that as input from the user, so let's call the input function and give the user a prompt. Once we've gotten that from the user, we'll want to create a file object and save that user data to file. This time, however, we'll use the A string for mode because we want to append data to the file. That is, each run of the program, we want to open the file and write something new into it as opposed to creating a new file or simply reading from it. Then, we'll write our username to the file object. In order to ensure that our data is clear in the file, at the end of our user string, we'll add a character that looks like \n, but all it simply does is add a new line to the file after each username is written, to make the file read more cleanly. Then we'll close our file object and get on to the reading part of this program. Now we'll create a second file object in order to read the data from the file we've been writing to into our Python program. Make sure we specify the same file name, but this time let's use the R mode to specify that we want to read from this file. Let's create a user list variable to hold the list of users that have been typed into the file. Let's make sure to read data from our second file object so that we have our previous user list. Then let's print the user list to the user and give them some information about what they're seeing. At this point, our program is ready to run, and let's pass it some data a few times to make sure that the information in our usernames file is continuing from session to session. So first, let's enter one username, and then run the program again. The first user is now added to the list of users in our username file. Let's close the program and try it one more time with a second user. This time, let's specify a second user to see the difference when we look at our user list. This time, both users have been written to file and added to our user list. We've covered the basics of reading and writing files within the Python programming language. While there's a lot more to look at in regards to objects and how to use them in your Python programs, we'll study this concept in more specific detail later. In the next lesson, we'll look at how you can create your own functions and variables within those functions.